And already before the theme was out, she was talking about all this work that she's doing with diversity and inclusion and her interest in this. A lot of it spurring from her upbringing in post-apartheid, which I won't go too far into because I'll let her do that. But she is a strategy director at Fitch, and so she'll talk about kind of her upbringing as well as how she integrates inclusivity into the workplace. So please welcome Nomfundo.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. I too am not a morning person, but I want to say, first and foremost, thank you to the CM team for giving me the platform to talk about something that I think is so incredibly important. The first order of business is defining what inclusivity means to me. So, what is inclusive? Inclusivity to me is understanding the importance of stories and the fact that everybody has a story to tell, and that we should be celebrating those stories, and that we should be amplifying the stories that don't get told as often as they should be. The dominant culture is one in which people with the loudest voices, people with the most resources, and people with the biggest platforms are usually the ones who get to tell their stories. That doesn't help, you know. And when I was thinking about sharing my story and coming to how I use inclusivity and principles of inclusivity in my daily life, I was stuck for how to structure and frame my talk. And so usually when I hit a corner, I turn to my patron saint, the one and only the Beyonce Knowles, who can usually guide me out of corners of darkness. And for those of you who are stans like me, you might know that Beyonce is, the number 4 is really, really important to her. So she was born on September 4th. Her husband, the cheater, Jay-Z, was born on December 4th. Beyonce was married on April 4th, and she actually named her daughter Blue Ivy, which is the Roman numeral IV, with the number 4. And in addition to being an amazing singer and being just generally fabulous, Beyonce and I have a lot of other things important in common, and number 4 is one of those things. So I was born in 1984 in South Africa, in a country at the time that was pretty much defined by being exclusive. South Africa was colonized by the Dutch and the English in the 17th century. And by 1948, we were ruled by a minority white government under a system called apartheid. And apartheid is basically a racialized system of oppression and exclusion. It's institutionalized. And it means that race touched every single aspect of South African social life. South Africans, by birth, were characterized into one of 4, or classified rather, into one of 4 racial groups. You were black, you were white, Asian, or colored. And that label defined where you went to school, where you lived, where you could work, what you learned at school, etc., etc. Where you could socialize. Is all public spaces and amenities were divided up by race. The 80s was, in South Africa, quite a violent decade. So I was born into not only a system of total exclusion, it was also an incredibly violent place to live. By 1994, the system of apartheid had legally fallen. So in 1994, in April 4, South Africa held its first open, free, fair, democratic elections. And I remember because I was just short of 10 years old at the time. And I remember my parents volunteered as election officials. And there were tears, and there was fighting, there was blood, there was sweat. And there was this overwhelming sense that even as a young child, I knew that South Africa would not be the same ever again, and that we had a lot of work to do, and that it would be difficult for us to learn to be inclusive when, by definition, we were exclusive. South Africa needed a new national anthem. We needed a new constitution. We needed a new, framework for how to talk to each other, to listen to each other, to live next to each other. South Africa had to learn lessons that, as I identify as one of South Africa's integration generations. So I wasn't quite born free, as they call them, but I also wasn't old enough to remember the difficult times. So I was part of a transition period in that I actually physically integrated schools. So I was often the only black person on the playground in a country that was over 90% black, the only black person at the sleepover, on the hockey team, on the swimming team, at school. And that obviously was quite traumatic for me in a lot of ways. And there was feelings of isolation that I went through that I didn't quite know how to deal with because I was so young. I knew that I needed to peace out and leave South Africa probably, and digest some of those experiences. Which led me to the United States. And by my second year of college in about 2004, I discovered African American literature, and it changed my life. and I've always been interested in Black culture, Black American culture. I mentioned Beyonce the second that I could, because I felt like the Black American experience and the Black South African experience were quite mirrored in a lot of ways, both in a history of slavery, but in how people express themselves and how people construct narratives to talk about what they've been through and find connection between each other. So it was the work and the writing of Black women, writers in particular, that really touched me. Alice Walker and Toni Morrison, Lorraine Hansberry, all of these amazing women who were able to do what I couldn't do at my tender age of late teens and early 20s, is digest some of what I've been through and think about how to move forward from it. And I came across a writer named Kimberly Crenshaw around that time who had a fantastic theory called intersectionality. And intersectionality, in its most crude definition, is basically an analytical framework invented by a Black feminist that tries to identify how interlocking systems of power impact those who are the most marginalized in society. It takes those relationships into account and in aid of trying to promote social justice and equality. So it looks at race, education, sexuality, ability, all of the labels and all of the categories we bring to every experience. And for me, it really helped to sort of frame how, okay, I'd been through a lot, but what had everybody else been through, and how can I begin to relate to people, and how can I bring that experience of being so isolated and turn it into a way to empathize with people. And interestingly, intersectionality actually, it doesn't become about you, it becomes about others. So you start to view people, and you want to listen to their story, basically. And if you're in a position of privilege in any way, intersectionality helps you think about strategies, at least it does for me, try to amplify those voices who may be marginalized or more marginalized than you are. So by 2014, I was living in Hong Kong permanently. I actually lived in 3 countries in 2013. So 2013 was a tough year. 2014 felt like a landing. And so now I'm a strategy director at Fitch, as Diana mentioned, and I oversee a team of strategists. Fitch is a company of about 40 people, and I've been causing trouble at Fitch for about 2 years because of my intersectional thinking and how I approach the workplace and how I try to build teams and how I try to build culture. Now, I'm keenly aware of my insider-outsider status a lot in Hong Kong because I'm not quite Western. People will be like, oh yeah, the West, and South Africa doesn't happen to fit into that category. But I'm also not from Hong Kong. So insider-outsider gives me a perspective, and intersectional thinking helps me use that perspective as a tool to make other people feel included. So how I do that at Fitch, recently we launched an initiative I launched an initiative with my team called 5 Slides of Me. And what I noticed in Hong Kong offices, and this Fitch is not the first one that I've worked in, is they can be quite hierarchical. And people who talk and present the ideas in the creative industry are often the most powerful people in the business, the people who are at the top. So I looked around and I thought, how do I get the team to talk more and to feel like they have a platform to talk? So 5 Slides with Me, basically, every Friday, a random person is picked, it's not that random, to talk about themselves for 5 slides. It can be 5 minutes or more, however long it takes you to get through it. Tell us anything about yourself at all. It doesn't have to be about work. And we started it off with somebody at work who's a sneakerhead, so we didn't know that about him. He's an incredibly interesting person. And I picked him because in the very brief interactions I had with him when he started, I knew he was quite expressive. And the next week I picked somebody who was a little less expressive and somebody who was less comfortable talking. And the next week I might think about picking somebody who's new, or the next week somebody who's been at the business for a long time. So I tell people that it's random, but it's really not. It's from my observations and thinking about how to include people actively, that 5 Slides of Me has been quite a success and continues to be. So how can you employ intersectional thinking in your everyday life? I think it's important to reflect. So there are 4 points, of course. Be honest with yourself, examine your surroundings and your privilege. I have to ask, often I say, oh, I'm an insider-outsider, but I'm also a Western-educated person who is a foreigner in Hong Kong, who comes to, the workplace with some privileges. People want to listen to me because I come from a culture where talking and expressing yourself is important. Not everybody else does, but I use that as a tool to empower the people on my team. Lean into the discomfort. When I say that I cause trouble, I really do. By asking questions about fairness, by representing people who don't have a platform or voice to speak at work. It doesn't always feel good, but if it did, we would do it all the time. We need to be disruptive, we need to be a bit uncomfortable sometimes. Pick your battles. I hate this phrase because people will say pick your battles, and they mean the ones that you don't fight, which is really odd. Picking your battles for me is about empowering the ones that you do fight. The most meaningful things in life are worth fighting for. So when I pick my battles, I go all in because I picked the battle and I want to fight it and I want to win it and I want, the people that I'm trying to fight for to win too. And finally, remember that diversity is a fact and inclusion is a choice. So the presence of diverse experiences, just because you can tick a box and say you have a certain number of people, doesn't mean that you are inclusive. You have to actually try. You have to go all out to ask the difficult questions. And something I said at work is that we actually have quite good gender representation in terms of senior leadership. And we had a meeting about it, and I said, well, that's really great, but we can't just stop there. So in what other ways are we not inclusive? Are we inclusive in terms of generation? Do people who don't, have just started to have, a platform to speak, and are we empowering them with training and making them feel like they are progressing in their careers? Ethnic diversity in Hong Kong it can be quite controversial. So what does our senior leadership look like? We may have a lot of women, but doesn't mean it represents the people of Hong Kong. Should it? These are questions that are important to ask. And finally, this is a quote that I really love by, I think, the most brilliant living writer at the moment, Toni Morrison. If there's a book you want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. And that's how I feel about inclusion. And even if it makes me not that popular sometimes, I'm here to write a more inclusive world, and I encourage you all to do the same. Thank you. Yes, do you guys know what Fitch is? I say Fitch. It's not the rating agency. People think it's the rating agency. So Fitch is a branding, retail, and design consultancy based here in Hong Kong. We actually have 16 studios globally. And we create brand experiences that move consumers' emotions. If you want to get in touch with Fitch, it's just fitch.com. You can find the Hong Kong office. I'm on Twitter all the time, unfortunately. It's not great for my mind, but I need it. At Nomfundo Sarah, opinions are online. And my email address is nomfundo.msomi@fitch.com. Email me if you want to ask me anything at all. Thanks.
So we're going to save all Q&A at the end for both of them to come up. So if you have a question, write it down, just keep it in your noggin. So our next speaker is Eric Ho. So Eric is co-founder of Architecture Commons, which he'll kind of talk about a bit. What made it really interesting when he applied was that he literally just got off the boat, fresh off the boat yesterday, from something called Peace Boat Project, which he'll go in and how he kind of understood a bit deeper into what inclusive means and now how he kind of integrates it back into his work life with Architecture Commons. So please welcome Eric.
Thank you so much, Diana, and the team at CreativeMornings and Nomfundo. That was very, very inspiring, and I would love to have that at my workplace. Love to talk to you about that. So I'm the co-founder of Architecture Commons, and I just got fresh off of it. We do, at Architecture Commons, we basically work on architecture, and our DNA is about building the commons for different kinds of people and shaping the environment for that. And we also are embarking on a journey of doing more strategy work to integrate sort of the process of design into the built environment. So I would love to talk a little bit more about how we have been shaping the habitats for inclusivity and how can we actually shape the habits for people that actually goes into these environments. So a little bit more into myself. I was trained as an architect, but I also teach at Parsons on design strategy and design thinking. And I also was in a startup doing different entrepreneurial and testing different ways to sort of engage people. We're all about kind of getting how can we sort of bring different people together and start different journeys of whether it is build environments or a process of getting to that. So for me, what has been inclusivity for me was really providing the opportunity for people to realize their full potentials and leaving no one behind. And that's the DNA behind Architecture Commons work. So just very, very briefly, like we did a lot of work that is about youth empowerment. From kindergarten to in the middle, sort of youth center that we work with, activity center for the youth in Hong Kong and Stanley, and also the left is actually revitalization of the Continental Magistracy for the youth leadership for the Leadership Institute for the Hong Kong Federation of Youth Groups. And one of the projects that I'm actively working on is a youth hostel, like 80-unit youth hostel that was funded through LegCo. Basically, what they did is to do subsidized housing for the youth for 2 to 5 years, and basically how we can do that to empower communities and youth that have really low income and provide the opportunity for them to actually create opportunities for each other and create training for them. So what leads me to Peace Boat is the client that we're working on invited me to go onto the Peace Boat for a journey through the Hong Kong, through the Leadership Institute. And does anyone of you know what the Peace Boat is before this? Okay, I didn't either. So I came in with a lot of skepticism. It's like, what is the Peace Boat? So Peace Boat apparently is a international NGO. Japan is based to promote peace, human rights, and sustainability. It's guided by the UN Sdg Goals. And what they have done is basically embark on these global journeys to take people around the world and sort of cultivate training and experiential learning and inter-cultural communications between the people on the boat. And these are the SDG goals for people that are not familiar. How many of you knows about the SDG goals? Okay, quite a number of you. So I'm particularly interested in a few of them, which is the sustainable cities and communities, and also peace, justice, and partnership. So we embarked on this journey actually last week, and we were in Osaka doing a bit of field work with some of the Japanese organizations that the Peace Boat was working with. We have about 30 delegates from Hong Kong and a few from other countries as well. We were there to do field work, and then we were looking at all these different sustainability goals and kind of figuring out how we can actually help the Asian communities to build an inclusive future. So this is the Peace Boat. It's basically a cruise ship that has about 1,000 passengers, and most of the audience are elderlies from Japan that went on the Peace Boat to explore, the world, but also to sort of interact and mingle with different people. There's also a pretty good amount of audience that are the youths from about 20s to 30s that are sort of exploring what their life means and sort of the purpose in life. And I'm gonna skip a lot of what we've actually done on the boat, but we've basically gone through, a few series of design thinking. How can we actually use the SDG goals to promote, some of the things that each of the teams are working on. And one of the things that we've worked with is looking at how can we create a better future through cross-generational exchanges. And we interviewed a lot of the youth and the elderlies on the boat. We actually did quite a number of interviews, and there were a lot of interesting insights that we started with, which is we know that there's a problem in Asia that youth poverty is, in quote, youth poverty is an issue where the youth are spending a lot of time working and oftentimes very overworked, and they really don't have time to do anything else, right? They don't have time to think about their future. They really don't have time to think about what their dreams are. And so we kind of, based on some of these insights that our team had, kind of talked to a lot of the youth on the boat, and we kind of confirmed a lot of them that is actually the case. That's why they're actually on Peace Boat, because they want to sort of escape from that environment. And then we're like, okay, well, there's so many elderlies on the boat, right? So what if we turn and ask them the same sort of issue? And what we found was actually really, really interesting. almost all of them said that's actually not an issue for them. They basically were like, well, you guys are in such a privileged environment with so many resources. We went through wars, we went through a lot of different things, and you guys are so impatient. You guys are always talking about dreams. Why don't you just work harder and sort of, make your living? From that, we were like, okay, well, let's figure out something. Let's figure out how can we create a conversation and experience between these two generations. What if we do something like a dating game, right? Or like a Tinder for cross-generation exchange, right? So the youth and the elderly will both have their profiles on, their interests, their occupation, and so to promote, the common interests and what they could really build sort of a relationship on. We'll match them with, what they like if they like cooking together or if they like travel together, then we get them to go on their first date. If they don't like each other, it's fine. They can just, say hi and then, go on their way. But if they really like each other, what this could do is also promote more conversations and experiences together. And one of our thoughts is this is really great on the boat where there's no internet access and everyone is sort of trapped in the same place for 100 days for 100 days around the world. So we can create different sort of scenarios within the habitats of the peace boat to shape sort of the habit of how they can sort of start talking to each other, or not necessarily just starting to talk to each other, but just engaging and sort of experiencing life together in different means. So they could go on to play music together, explore a common topic of a book, they could go dancing together. One of the things that is pretty apparent is also, mentoring each other, right? Like the elderlies have a lot of experiences they can share with the youth, but the youth also share a lot of experience with the digital tools and what they could do to sort of teach them, how to engage more with the youth. So for us, within the group, how can we create better communication with the elderlies? How can we break a barrier? But really, how can we solicit and kind of cultivate empathy to understand where each other come from? And how can we extend sort of this idea outside of such a confined environment where they're all trapped together into, could the peace boat ideology extend to, outside of the boat to peace bus, peace plane, peace train, peace building, etc. So we actually did a lot of engagement within the boat because we have so much time there. We got a lot of responses. In the middle, we can say, would you support this project? And almost everyone says yes, because it's such a big issue. And you can see the different colors are basically youth or elderly, and that's kind of where the audience, the sort of sample size comes from. So this is like a very, very small project, and I think it's kind of what I would share as the beginning of something. And I think in my work and in sort of my realization is, instead of just looking at how we can build a better future, is really how we can sort of swoop back and say, what is really the present and how can we cultivate inclusive has to start from empathy. And we really need to start to understand each other's perspective and sort of align our goals together in order to actually move forward. And I think that's, to me, it's my training in inclusivity. This is Inclusivity 101 for me. So what I have been doing is really kind of how can we sort of create some of these processes and tools and then sort of embark a journey where it's not just about one part, one sector of the people, one category of people, but from different sectors of the society. And so we're actually serious about this project, and so and also taking this back to some organizations in Hong Kong that would also be interested in cultivating these cross-generation gaps. So if you're interested, we'd love to talk to you and reach out to me, and we'd love to meet all of you in any case. Thank you so much.
Okay, anyone want to kick it off? Hello. can direct it at one or two or both.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay? Thank you very much for your talk, Eric and Nomfundo. Nomfundo, this question is for you. I could relate to a few elements of what you were talking about because I grew up in a part of India where class and caste system was quite rampant. My question for you is, as you lead and work with your teams, what are some things that you've tried that you got wrong, i.e. some assumptions that you made? Because I try and approach it from my perspective, but sometimes I get it wrong because I don't. So I was curious if you had any that you could share.
Thank you so much. That's an excellent question because I get it wrong quite often. And something that's a huge theme in our particular business, and it might be across different creative businesses in Hong Kong, is brainstorming is critical, right? You need to get people together in a room to be creative. We often don't have the time to have long and amazing brainstorms with a big lunch break in the middle to talk creative ideas out. Brainstorms aren't for everybody. And I think initially my instinct at the business I work at is to include everybody, as many people as you possibly can. Come in, I swear you can put your idea out there, it'll be totally democratic, everybody can talk, no ideas are, out of the question. And we just don't have the framework in order for, I mentioned earlier about how the business is quite hierarchical, and a lot of businesses are. I mean, it's not damning a pitch, it's just common. So if you've got people who aren't used to contributing, you can't just throw people in a room and assume that everybody is going to be comfortable talking about ideas that way. It's also really obvious that people have different creative processes. So I verbalize in order to understand. Not everybody does. So I've gotten it wrong, and that brainstorms have gone awry. They've been difficult. It's been hard to get to an end point. And it leaves people feeling super frustrated, actually. That sometimes the best thing is for me to have time to think about a really good briefing and to frame what the problem is in a way that everybody understands, and then everyone goes away to think about it before we come back with ideas. Or we break out into teams. Or we get 90% of the way there as a strategic team, and then we bring creative in towards the end to to analyze and to question the assumptions that we've come up with or the narrative we've come up with. So for sure brainstorming and group sessions have been quite tough, and I went to a college in the US that was all about talking and writing, and it's small seminar style classes. I just come from that background, and the assumption that everybody does was wrong, and gets it wrong for me a lot.
Anyone else? Come on, guys. Should we just grab the mic? Yes, please. All right, good.
So, hi, good morning. This is a question, any of you can answer it, but it's specifically of something you mentioned in your talk, Nomfundo. How do you know, the extent of your privilege and the responsibility that privilege you carry, how can I explain it? When you realize you have privilege, how do you know the extent of the responsibility that privilege carries? Did I explain it correctly?
Yeah, that's a great question. Maybe you can start. I'm just thinking about Peace Boat and other stuff that you've done, facilitating and talking to people.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of times a lot of assumptions that we make of each other, and I think that to me is always the point that we think this is the right thing to do, but it was really surprising to actually, if you start really empathizing and looking at each other, actually that assumption is totally wrong. And I think that's something that I think a lot of times of privilege or non-privilege have on each other. And I think that's something that we have to get out of it. And from there, kind of how do we build a common ground? Knowing that they both have assumptions of each other's sort of perspective. So that's pretty general. I'll let you jump into it.
I think so. And for me, I think I've accepted that it's a process. And so there are many ways in which I don't acknowledge how I'm privileged, because I don't have the tensions, or I've never been questioned, or I'm just not as reflective as I like to think that I am, It's a good question, because I think it's something that we should be asking ourselves all the time. And to not be too hard on yourselves as well. I remember once, a couple of years ago, I worked for an NGO in Cape Town, and it was around workers' rights, And so a lot of the people we worked with were, minors and the people who were paid very poorly, who worked in very dangerous jobs. And I, in our meetings, often felt like I shouldn't be speaking because I was like, well, first of all, I'm super privileged and I'm middle class and I'm in this place and I'm like, I only had this internship because my CV was interesting to this NGO. And one of my bosses said to me, at the end of a meeting, why don't you ever contribute when I ask questions? And I was like, well, and I explained that. And she was like, you realize you've gone too far because you're actually assuming that you're not equal to everybody. There's an inverse to what you're doing, which is basically like, everyone else is like, I don't know, too precious, or their experience, you've essentialized people, and actually we are all equal, so just talk. And if you have something to say, just answer the question, and don't always think in your head all the time about how you shouldn't be speaking or whatever it is, because it's actually not helpful. And that was humbling for me, but it's active. So keep questioning your privilege. I'm not sure if you ever know that you've gone too far. I think, and unless you have attention, but then keep evolving again and keep asking yourself those questions again.
Thank you. Hi. I do have a question for Eric, but first, just like on that, following up on that last comment, that last topic, I think it's always an interesting challenge to look at privilege. How, are you not? There's always people more privileged than I, but I'm more privileged than others. And I think that empathy is the key word, right? But it's not the same as sympathy, right? So it is trying to really more deeply understand the experience of the other person. And for yourself, whatever opportunities you have in life, I think I personally always view it as fortunate. I always remain humble and thankful of what I have. Because I was born into it. I was born into a lucky circumstance, luckier than others, not as lucky as other people. So my privilege isn't a thing that I think makes me better or a different class than anyone else. It's just I've been luckier in life. And so that's about it. Eric, the specific question I have for you is something like this peace boat. What's the ultimate goal? Is it to help drive public policy? Are you experimenting with a model for helping to create empathy amongst different groups? Are you looking to expand this beyond an age difference into religions or political differences or any other groups that seem to lack an understanding with each other? And I'll let you answer that one first.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think the peace boat, as far as I understand it, operates kind of both ways. One is as a consultant to the UN, advise on strategies or policies, etc. I'm not sure how they have been doing it so far. But the other, which I think is the main piece of it, is really to reinforce these sort of ideologies of the Sdg Goals for pretty mainstream audience, well, mostly Japanese in their case, where the elderlies that we talk to are basically, most of them are people that want to just go on a cruise, right? So, but they do have this ideology in mind that, Peace Boat has these goals, and they understand that before they embark. So what they're trying to do on the boat is creating programs like these where would sort of expose some of these awareness to the more mainstream audience and allow them to kind of think for themselves and what these things mean for them for day-to-day life. So really about the experience of life on a boat, but sort of sprinkled with sort of some of these ideologies as they go on. So that's my understanding of it. And for us, I think is a very specific sort of goal for the 30 delegates within this experience. Most of them are based in Hong Kong, so I think this is sort of a way to cultivate a way to strengthen sort of our understanding of the SDG goals and how we might apply those kind of things in a society like Hong Kong, which a lot of times is very far removed from a lot of target audience of what the UN goals are. So how can a first world, first tier city like Hong Kong, how can those kind of principles be applied to a place like Hong Kong? And I think there's some things here that I think that we've discovered in the Japanese society that actually does apply to Hong Kong as well. So I think that's what we're sort of striving for the inclusivity for sort of in an Asian context. So that's my takeaway from it.
Okay, all right, thank you very much.
Sorry.
Just pass it back.
Hi, morning. Yeah, thank you both for your talks, very, very inspiring. I have a question in regards to confronting discrimination and especially with regards to gender and racial discrimination in the workplace. So past two places I've worked, it's both been a personal experience in regards to gender discrimination, and I've witnessed a lot of racial issues within the workplace as well, which I confronted to my managers, that I was faced with being ridiculed for being too politically correct. So I just wanted to ask both of you for suggestions, if you've experienced this, if you've done that kind of confrontation before, how did you manage that kind of conversation? Because both times I've been experiencing issues with managers not being able to understand and see what I see, and I don't know if it's just a generational gap or, if you have any suggestions, I'd really appreciate it.
That's hard, and I understand because I've had a similar experience and similar experiences elsewhere. For me, being the kind of insider outsider, people are willing to hear me out on how things play out in other markets, in other countries. I say markets because that's what we say in our industry. So sometimes I'll use examples for other businesses that do things differently and how it's gone well for those businesses. For me, I love Patagonia, I'm obsessed with them. They've got an amazing woman CEO who, they've got on-site daycare, and we're talking about turnover once, and I thought, how am I gonna present what I think might be a good idea to try to stop that or to control it or to manage it somehow. And having on-site daycare at Patagonia actually means that they've got really, really low turnover because they're not losing parents that have to, go off and look after children. And it's been really good for the business because you retain that knowledge and you have these people who work for a business for a long time and they end up being super supportive for the business and they can speak really positively about it. And there's lots of other examples like that. So I was like, well, instead of being super upset about why there is turnover or a specific person who's left or done whatnot, I'll talk about an inspiring and interesting business that does something differently. And I find that just having that fodder and having those talking points really helps, so then even if it is super personal, because the political is personal and the personal is political, to try to step away a little bit and think about how we're doing it in a business context, and that kind of language, the powers that be are more receptive to you if you've got some of those examples. And then, this is a really simple one, but sending an email and then not sending it is, and then taking 24 hours is another way. And again, I think that those are both strategies and distance. So can you just step back a little bit and think about what it is and try to place that into a larger context and have some talking points about why tolerating that kind of thing is bad. Is bad for business, is bad for culture, ultimately.
I just have a simple add to that. I think, so I actually lived in New York for 12 years before coming back 6 months ago. So I'm actually having a lot of difficulty in terms of the adapting to the culture here, even though I was born and raised here. So a lot of times, and this is a pretty general comment, I think a lot of times when we're dealing with people expecting each other to behave differently, one thing that I try is how do you actually translate it in a term that they would understand or in a term that they actually care, and find a way to get to your agenda, of course, but how can you translate that wording or that the way that they think into a place where both of you are okay with and you can live with. But the term, like, how do you actually communicate that, and I call it kind of translation. So like translation of the values, like how you translate your value into his value or her value. So, see if that helps.
Thank you.
Thanks. I haven't quite figured out how to articulate this question, so maybe bear with as I try and frame it. It's about culture in a creative workplace, so perhaps more directed to you, Nomfundo. I think, so I work in a big ad agency. I've worked with them for many years in London and in New York, and moved here last year. And I think what you were talking about around becoming aware that you come from a place that has certain that has drummed certain defaults into you about the way that you might conduct yourself at work, the way that you run bracelets, for example, or things like that. I think there have been definite times when I've been realizing since coming here that there are things that are different here, obviously, right? And I think some of those fall under the umbrella of perhaps more non-negotiable things. And I think things like inclusivity, some of the race, the gender points, I think that for me would be under that bucket. But then I think there's a nuanced difference between that and things that are maybe more cultural differences that or preferences that should be respected about the place that you're in and the way that people like to do things. So for example, I think I've always really enjoyed getting to know the people I work with and building strong friendships with them. I think that's really important, and that's been really helpful for me in my career and just makes life more fun and interesting, I think. So, but that might be one example where I feel like I've had moments of noticing that that's not necessarily always the case in other cultures, and this I think is what, in my experience, one of them. So I'm trying to think out the question here. I think, have you had to deal with, I think that's quite a confronting thing, because you realize that the way that you see your standard practices not necessarily being the norm, and how have you dealt with that when it's not under those almost things that are the battles you necessarily pick to use your frame?
Yeah, I get it. That's a good question. I mean, I've been so lucky to live in so many different places, you know, as you have, and I like to think that my colleague Frankie might disagree with me, that I listen more than I speak, because there are microcultures and there are macrocultures. My husband's like, no. Fair enough. But I live in those places, and I've gone to those places because I want to be a part of those places, and I've got a lot more to learn, and I think just listening, observing, and appreciating what's great about Hong Kong that's the first place to start, you know, because for me those daily differences, I don't even want to call them differences, but those habits that are drilled into me, I think you drop some of them over time. I like to think that I conduct my life like a Hong Konger. I love this place so much, and I just appreciate so many things about Hong Kong. My kids were born here, and so shout out to Universal Healthcare, because Queen Mary Hospital is where it's at if you'd like to talk about a baby. And I look around and I see so much beauty, and I see so many interesting things, and I'm such an advocate of this city when I leave. I talk about how special it is to live somewhere so efficient and somewhere so transparent. That's not a given, that's not where I was born. I like that our transportation, you know, it seems egalitarian, that you can see Chow Yun-fat apparently on the NTR sometimes if you look hard enough, because he likes to take the NTR. I think first about what's good about Hong Kong, I would say, and then those differences of how things are conducted in New York, and it could be specific agencies too. I've lived and worked in London and in India, and you know, I came away from those places thinking, well, that was awesome, you know, and I learned so much as a South African, and I was so humbled. It's the more bigger, higher value stuff, you know, some of what you were talking about, that these are my principles, and this is what I believe is fair and right, and I think that's universal, you know. I don't think anyone's comfortable with racial discrimination, even if the manifestation of how people talk about those things might seem a little bit odd in terms of how you might talk about them. Fundamentally, I think we don't like it when people feel bad, right? All of us. I don't think we like to make people feel bad, right? It's not very nice, you know. It causes, you know, toxic work environments. Unfairness doesn't feel good, and if you benefit because of unfairness, I think you can't really revel and celebrate in your benefit. You know, you're still thinking, I only got here because of dot dot dot. So remember the fundamentals. Don't sweat the small stuff, because the small stuff is what you need to maybe unlearn. Also, you know, Hong Kong has taught me so much, and I'm glad, and I'm continuing to learn. But if I see something that's going down that's not great on a universal human level, I think that's where I'll pick the battle.
So small, yeah. If we have time. So I think what I assume what you're talking about is kind of the work style, work culture sometimes, and I've experienced that a lot because my firm actually does a lot of local work, and a lot of the employees are, has always been in Hong Kong and have been living in other places or privileged to see different sort of perspective. And one of the things that I've sort of started to sort of notice is, actually I had that experience in New York too, and where I worked was, founded by someone, from a different place in US, but still we have pretty Western culture, but still the first time that I was in it was like, this reminds me a lot of Asia, like, everything is very rule-based, everything is very sort of isolated, and there wasn't the communication and sort of the collaboration that I expected of the place. So when I come back to Hong Kong and I sort of experience sort of the general sort of macro work culture, especially in the more environment where I'm working with a lot of local collaborators or local firms, there is sort of the tendency of sort of thinking that that's how can I kind of understand a little bit more of how that works, and how can I incrementally sort of compare the two different sort of working ideologies and find a common ground that can actually allow me to learn more about what's the good thing about sort of for me the other side, and how can we sort of look at why sort of that's important for them, or how did that came about. And so for me it becomes a learning experience so far, and how can I actually start to empathize with the other side. I don't want to keep saying that, but in a lot of ways I do think like that in the beginning. So I think I'll just leave it at that.
Real quick, we have a bit of time. Selfishly, I have a question for Eric. So, as an architect, you work. Basically, your job revolves around the built environment, right? So many times in Hong Kong, and I've been here for 7 years, I walk into a building and I'm just like, oh, this feels really cold, and this is not. And yeah, it just makes me a bit cringy and uncomfortable. I can't really pinpoint exactly what it is, and I also wonder, is it because like I grew up in the States and Asia has a different view of comfort when you walk into a building, but something in me is kind of like, I feel like no one would really like this. So when you go through the planning stage and everything, how do you guys even think about how do you include everyone in that built environment when you step into the building? How do you make someone feel like they're included or they belong there?
So that's a great question, because that traditionally is not a job of an architect in a lot of ways. So the operations of the building, we design the system so that it could be flexible in whatever ways that the client likes to use it. Usually the operation actually falls back into the client side, and of course, like there's strategies to make the building design become more welcome, like maybe softer lights or preferences of styles that would make the building better. So that's the challenge that I'm facing now, and how I can bring in that process that at least I care about, and about what you care about, how do you should actually experience the space in terms of all the aspects of it, and bringing that process into the design process with the client, because a lot of times it's very top down, like the client wants this or that, and then your job is done, we'll operate it from this point onwards. So that's really the challenge that I'm facing and sort of trying to tackle. So there are buildings obviously that are or clients that see that as something that they need, but a lot of times there are other more important things to tackle and to figure out first before we get to understanding the user. So yeah, that's my take on it.
Yeah, because I actually I have to go to immigration, and any immigration or any sort of government office you go to, it's like, oh God, like, you know, it's on your to-do list, chore list kind of.
I've got a question that comes back to something that you mentioned in reply to a question, which is that nobody likes to make anybody feel uncomfortable. That's a universally disliked feeling. I think that today, I've been having a lot of discussions lately in my workplace about diversity and inclusion, and it's clear that by raising this issue, I am making people feel extremely uncomfortable to the extent where they don't want to be open to empathy. They want to push back. And it's not just these individuals. I think we're seeing that resurge in the kind of global political arena massively, and it's changing how our world looks. So I think if we're a truly inclusive world, we can't just assume that everybody agrees that empathy is key and that they're ready to empathize. But at the same time, if we want to achieve a world that I think we all believe in, we need some kind of solution. So I'm wondering if either of you have any recommendations there. Big question, sorry.
Wow. I don't have an answer, and I understand what you're saying about discomfort. And I guess again, for me, it is just the agenda that I picked, and it's the expression. This is my expression of that agenda. I think other people go about it differently. You know, there's this whole idea of being an intrapreneur. Do you know about that phrase? I feel like it was quite common at Frog Design maybe a decade and a half ago. And, you know, as nonprofit people or social enterprise people entering traditional corporations and being like, well, I can change it from the inside, you know? And it sounds very noble, but some people say, oh, I'm gonna compromise, using air quotations, on knowing that I can't move the needle fully in the way that I want to see, but even just a little bit at a place this big or with this much influence makes a difference. You know, a friend of mine works for a massive tech company, the biggest one in the world, wink wink, and actually has a diversity inclusion role there. And she comes from a nonprofit background where, you know, when they, you know, impact communities, it's they know in 2 years it made a massive difference. And here she's saying what's frustrating is that it's tens of thousands of people, and they have a simple task, a complicated simple task, to be more inclusive, and they just don't know how to do it. From the interview stages to, you know, how they evaluate CVs, to the kinds of schools that they go to talk to people, to where they embed themselves in communities, they just don't know. But because it's so massive and has such a huge impact on the world, me changing something 1% is really, really big, you know, and it's hard for her because she's like, before I could say I've done something, and now I'm like, I've done so little because I don't necessarily feel it, and I'm not going to feel it. She might be there for a decade and she leaves and it still hasn't changed all that much, but that little bit was something. That's her expression of that agenda, you know, so I get it. I think you just need to, you know, not everybody's going to empathize. I'm never going to back down on that, you know, and saying and thinking that the world needs to change in the way that I've identified and that other people in the world have identified. And people will pick a lane. Hopefully there's some consensus so that we're not doing opposite things, you know. So I don't know what my, you know, business will look like that I work for in 5 years, or my community. I hope that something as small as a presentation on a Friday where people talk about themselves and we take a break from hearing, you know, from the top down has some impact, you know, whether it's on culture on a daily basis or people moving on to other businesses and feeling like somebody listened to me, and seeing the smiles on people's faces, because actually colleagues go to lunch together all the time, and sometimes it's like, oh, you're being acknowledged finally. I know this about you, but the rest of the business didn't know this about you, because we get lunch all the time, and just hearing everybody clap at the end, and it's Friday, so you get to leave. It feels good, and I hope that it sticks, and I hope that it stays, and it might not be a different hiring process, you know, that fundamentally changes the business, but it's just that little bit. I'll never back down. Maybe that's an answer. Don't back down. I know that people might not want to listen, but you can't, because there's too much at stake.
So I think I would add something small to it. It's about how the entrepreneurial thinking, like how startups are thinking about, you know, tackling a new problem. Let's say empathy is a new problem. How can you create, you know, your first adopters, right? So how can you find an audience that, you know, actually may have shared, even in a big office, may share those values, and sort of cultivate those within the first adopter first, and bring awareness that this is something that's important for, you know, the the mainstream or the late adopters, right? So how can you create a culture within the first adopters and kind of just build from there and see what happens, right? Find people that align with that, find organizations that align with that, find a department that may be more open to sort of inclusive thinking, or maybe easier to implement if it's hard to implement in a company-wide scale, and then take that, be grateful about that if it works. If not, then maybe that company is not a place that you want to be, and you move to another company that really share those values that you value, and do as much as you can, and don't back down, and take what you have and move on.
Sorry, I think because of time we're going to have to wrap it up. Can we just get a final round of applause for